Today I am presenting one part of my PhD research, which is related to patriarchal attitudes and media representation of gender roles, with a specific focus on sex-selective abortion in Montenegro. This is the work in progress, so I'm looking forward to your comments and our constructive discussion later. So first, I will speak about sex-selective abortion, given that this is, as I said, the major focus of this analysis. Sex-selective abortion is one form of prenatal sex selection. Then we will go over theoretical background and the role of the media in this research. Afterwards, I will expose several specificities of my case study, actually the Montenegrin case, and then we will go over analysis and results together with the implications and limitations of this study. Sex-selective abortion, as you can see, presents one of the most contested and worrisome topics in gender-based analysis. Sex-selective abortion presents only one form of prenatal sex selection and actually presents the intentional elimination of female fetuses through abortion. Sex-selective abortion is dominantly proved with a skewed sex ratio at birth. So any significant and continuous deviation from a normal sex ratio is considered prenatal, as an evidence of the prenatal sex selection. So you can see here that usually the normal sex ratio is 100 girls per 105 boys. Any significant discrepancy from this proportion is considered as something that must involve the intentional human intervention. However, sex-selective abortion rates are very problematic, primarily from methodological perspective, and I will list several problems that we have with the data on prenatal sex selection. So first, sex ratio at births are dominantly based on census data or birth registries or data from non-certified clinics, given that the practice of sex-selective abortion is usually prohibited. So usually non-certified clinics are conducting this practice. The second problem presents unreported cases, so we can definitely have a doubt that the percentage of sex-selective abortion is underrated. We can never know the actual number, given that this practice is not prone to direct observation. Also, there is one stream in the literature that is very skeptical towards this practice and generally the practice of prenatal sex selection, which argues that we must consider several external factors which influence the distortion of sex ratio at birth. First, environmental factors, such as, for an example, war, given that the practice of sex selection is observed somewhere from the middle of the 20th century. Then the age and race of women are also considered as relevant factors. And finally, the biological predisposition of women to naturally give more birth to male than to female children. However, the existing statistics are very worrisome indicator that actually some form of prenatal sex selection indeed exists. The famous expression of missing girls is used in this context very often. Now, current projection involved the 45 million of missing girls due to the practice of prenatal sex selection, while around 150 million of missing women will be until 2035 if the prenatal sex selection would not be prevented. Now, the consequences of this practice are very clear. They are intuitively reinforcing gender discrimination and confirming certain prejudices in terms of preference for one sex compared to the other. However, we should not neglect men from this story as well. You will see later that I argue that the decision to undergo sex-selective abortion is dominantly shaped by some societal standards, and this works for men as well, who are pressured to continue their family line. It is also argued that the distortion in a sex ratio would lead towards greater violence and crime, and definitely exclusion women from education and even more pressure on them to be mothers and wives. The major theoretical framework of my research tries to interpret the practice of SSA as never autonomous choice, but rather an outcome of patriarchal beliefs. Now I take the concept of patriarchy by Sylvia Walby, where she argues that systematic patriarchy actually presents an interaction between private and public societal structures where women are continuously subordinated. And now I specifically focus on these public structures, since I argue that although patriarchy is exercised dominantly in a zone of privacy, it is exactly through their reproduction, so the reproduction of patriarchal beliefs in public space, in media, where we actually get a new sense of gender relations and existing discriminatory practices in a certain society. This is actually a relational approach that you can see in this screen, so that for some preference societies, as I said, SSA is never an autonomous choice, and this is very important even for a discussion on reproductive freedom. We can discuss this later. And the sustainability, as you can see, of sex-selective abortion significantly depends on public structure where the media have a very important position. So sex-selective abortion, it's actually the gender-selective abortion, since the preference for one sex compared to the other automatically assumes that parents already have an image of what their child should be. So they have an image about the gender roles that this child should fulfill. Now, the role of the media in this process, as I said, is very straightforward. The media presents one very important factor in terms of the public reproduction of patriarchy. So the basic function that the media have in this sense is to reconstitute, reinforce, or restrict certain practices that exist in a society. Therefore, given that the gender, if we treat the gender actually as a socially constructed phenomenon, then we can clearly see how the media have a role and a potential to reconstitute the existing gender relations. My research applied one novel and different form of the typical critical discourse analysis. So this is one very interesting stream in critical discourse studies, which argues that the media discourse is not influenced only by power structures in a society or those who are opinion makers. Rather, the media discourse is influenced by individual mental modes both from journalists and the audiences. Now, what are mental modes? Mental modes present subjective interpretations of certain situations or events, and we look for these subjective interpretations through the existence of opinions, emotion, words, and metaphors in the media discourse. The presumption is that such media discourse, which is not, let's say, value-free, although non-media discourse is completely value-free, but media discourse that is somehow biased or that contains emotional media language and metaphorical media language has a higher potential to influence media audience compared to the discourse that is, let's say, purely factual or factographic. Now, these are the crucial points of my analysis, my actually starting points. So first, I argue that it is important to investigate whether those who make a really significant impact on public opinion contribute to the resurgence of patriarchal beliefs. It is also very important to investigate how do the media report about practices such as sex-selective abortion, because it is not important if the media condemns this practice. They can easily treat women as moral sinners or crucial culprits in this sense. Also, I investigated the media initiative, since I argue that we cannot speak about serious journalism if the majority of the media stories are motivated by the outside actors, such as governmental or non-governmental actors, not media themselves. And as well, genres, since the difference between factographic and analytical genres might indicate the real media interest in reporting about a certain issue. These are the three hypotheses that I test. So the first hypothesis seems as an intuitive one. So the media discourse reinforces patriarchy by condemning SSA solely through endangered reproduction. So my presumption was that the general media discourse would point only to the lack of women who will give birth as the major consequence of the distorted sex ratio. Then the second hypothesis investigates the existing media initiatives, whether the majority of the media stories are initiated by the media or by the outside actors. And finally, that factual genres will dominate over analytical genres. The case study that I take is Montenegro. This is the country where I'm coming from. However, the data you see and the specificities of this case in the context of sex-selective abortion, of course, justified the selection of this case. So first, from 2012, that was the first official moment when United Nations Population Fund placed Montenegro at the top of the Southeast European country with distorted sex ratio at births. You can see several different sources, and these rates are continually growing. So for an example, in the last 3 years, sex ratio at birth is still distorted. We have 100 girls per 109 boys. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women obliged Montenegro to strictly prohibit sex-selective abortion, and this is prohibited. So any form of prenatal sex selection for non-medical reasons is prohibited in Montenegro. It is impossible to legally conduct this practice. And the newest study that was one of the most serious attempts to analyze prenatal sex selection across the globe listed Montenegro among 12 leading countries in the world with a significantly distorted sex ratio at birth. So it was the analysis from 1950 until 2017. So you can see several sources which identified this country among other countries which also have problems with sex ratio at birth. So you can generally see that Albania, Kosovo, and sometimes Macedonia dominate when it comes to the Southeast Europe. Now, current projections indicated the lack of 3,000 women in this country due to the prenatal sex selection. I must emphasize one very important information, that Montenegro is a very small country with almost 623,000 citizens. So this gives even more weight to these statistics. And the further estimations identified a deficit of 8,000 women until 2035 without prevention of prenatal sex selection. It is also interesting that young people have a sense of SSA as a practice occurring very often or sometimes in their country. And all of this provoked one campaign that was dominantly initiated by a Center for Women's Rights in Montenegro together with the agency McCann. This campaign was internationally recognized and awarded, and it was directed towards the practice of sex selection in this country. And later we will see who was the leading initiator of this campaign, which again adds additional weight to the role of the media when it comes to reinforcement or restriction of patriarchal attitudes. So these are some visuals from this campaign. More than 6,000 people signed the petition that was issued to the government of Montenegro. However, although they promised an action plan to combat prenatal sex selection, to the date, nothing happened. And as director of the Center for Women's Rights in Montenegro told me, this actually reflects the never completed gender emancipation in Montenegrin society. We have a very, very good, solid, actually, legal framework. However, the existing legal framework, as we can see, is not so efficient in decreasing distorted sex ratios. So this is obituary. This was only one very straightforward and emotional detail from the campaign. So you can see what they wrote. Last goodbye to dear Unwanted. Your parents wanted a boy, and this is why you did not get the chance to be born. Forgive them, you're grieving Montenegro. These are also some scenes. Usually people who are NG activists, journalists, some citizens, and some academic professors were involved in this campaign, and they openly supported the campaign. My research also monitored this period when this campaign occurred. So it was very interesting to see how did the media report about this event as well. Now, the major and the leading initiator of this campaign, Unwanted, was Montenegrin journalist Svetlana Slavujevic, who published an investigative story. This was the first serious journalistic attempt in Montenegro to investigate this issue and the context that created a demand for sex selection. She published anonymous testimonials of women that underwent SSA, and she gave a very substantive overview of different ways in which this practice can definitely be conducted. I will now play. You will hear one woman from northern Montenegro that actually conducted the practice of SSA. Just a moment, I'm sorry.
Otvoreno sam otišla kod njega i rekla mu ja bih da rodim treće dijete, odnosno ja bih sina. On mi se nasmijao i rekao, dobro, ja ti čestitam na hrabrosti, važi, idemo redom. I onda, naravno, rekla sam već kontroli i sve ostalo što je bilo potrebno. I iz tog razloga sam i radila da bude dječak, iz tog razloga sam i radila tu biopsiju, tu provjeru, kako se već zove, nebitno. Posle tog nekog, ne znam, truda ili ostala sam u drugom stanju i naravno, sa svojim ginekologom sam se konsultovala. On mi je zakazao sve te preglede. U Beogradu sam radila tu biopsiju i eto, imala sam sreću da to samo jedan put uradim.
So this was one among few public testimonials, anonymous testimonials of women that underwent SSA, and she also argued later that in her another statement that she was lucky enough to have a son, otherwise she wouldn't know how to come back home. This is a gynecologist also from the northern Montenegro, and this is her experience with the practice of.
Pa imali smo slučajeva gde je majka izrazila želju da želi da izvrši određivanje pola kako bi nakon 2 ili 3 devojčice rodila sina, jer prosto živimo u takvoj sredini gde te žene vrlo često budu manje vredne ili čak recimo imala sam jedan slučaj gde je muž hteo po svaku cenu sina, pa čak i po cenu da se razvede od žene jer je smatrao da ona ne može mu rodi muškog potomka.
So this was actually the first time where someone who is a journalist unraveled the context of sex-selective abortion, and this is the major and leading motivator of the campaign Unwanted that actually somehow made this practice of SSA visible in Montenegrin society. Now, sex-selective abortion and the desire to conduct one is not simple issue. It is very, as I said, complex outcome of several interrelated beliefs which are built for centuries. So you can see other data that demonstrates the level of gender awareness in Montenegrin society. So first, only 4% of Montenegrin women have house property ownership, and this is something that is very traditionalistic in Montenegrin society. Out of 11% of population never performing housekeeping, 96% are men. What is worrisome is that we see with a growing body of research that young people are becoming more conservative and more authoritarian. And this is not only in gender-related topics, but also in other topics which are related to politics. More than 60% of young people therefore think there should be strict division between male and female duties. So there are things that are done by men and things that are done by women. And finally, political power is dominantly male biased. And even in the new constitution of the Montenegrin parliament after the last election, we still have underrepresentation of women. Why the discourse is so important? Primarily because different meanings about the gender relations and even that relationship between sex and gender are created exactly through the discourse. So for an example here, in the Western Balkans, is very typical to say for a daughter to address her as a son. So parents unintentionally call her son, sine, instead of čerko, or daughter. This is one very interesting detail. Also, when a family consists from several daughters and one son, it is common to say for that son that he's jedinac, the only child in that family. And also, when it comes to enumerating the children, parents were usually hesitant to enumerate their female children when it comes to custody or anything similar like that. So these are some very interesting discursive practices which reveal the depth of the patriarchal beliefs which exist in this society, and also in some, of course, other societies, because as we could see, the difference between political, cultural, and economic systems that are involved in these distorted sex ratio tells us that patriarchy is a problem, of course, not only in the Western Balkans or Southeast Europe, but globally. Now, when it comes to the analysis, these are some important information that are related to methodology. So as I said, I applied the socio-cognitive discourse study with the qualitative and quantitative content analysis. The sample size consisted of 247 media news in print, electronic, and online media. So I tried to cover mainly the whole relevant media market in Montenegro. It was very hard to find official circulation rates that were serving to me as a reference point for selecting various media, but I managed. And these were the media that that had the largest circulation rates in Montenegro. And I also analyzed, of course, audience's comments, and there was 285 comments as a reaction to the online media articles. As you can see, press clipping involved the full coverage media research based on 3 keywords, so sex-selective abortion and unwanted, referring to the campaign. The sampling frame was 7 years, so from 2012, when United Nations Population Fund argued for a distorted sex ratio at birth in Montenegro, until the end of 2019. You can see that actually in more than 10 media was published only 247 media news for 7 years. So this is a very intuitive indicator of the general media interest in reporting about this issue. If we make a simple calculation, that would mean that one media published 3 stories per year about this issue. Now, when it comes to the results, as I expected, factual genres were present in the sample, which means that the majority of the media stories were either news reports or press releases, while the remainder was being analytical. I also found the connection between different types of the media genre and different types of the initiative, which means that those stories that were in analytical genres were dominantly initiated by the media compared to factual stories in factual genres that were dominantly motivated by the external actors. You can also see that the media initiative was very modest, so that a bit more than 23% of stories were motivated by the journalists, editors themselves. And even 76% of news was a response to the outside actors or events, so initiated by governmental or non-governmental actors. Here I am presenting the discourse strategies that account for the majority of the media discourse. So you can see that the strategies of factuality, topic inferiority, authority, and direct support were prevailing in the media. It is also important to say that I aimed at constructing different discourse strategies and developing their indicators so that they can be applicable to various contexts and various topics, not only to a specific case study. Now I will provide a few examples so that you can get a sense of what these different discourse strategies actually involved. When it comes to a strategy of factuality, this was the strategy which was very passive. It was pure reproduction of the already existing information. It was dominantly written in factual genres, and it was a completely absent media initiative from this discourse strategy. What is also notable here is that mental modes were absent, meaning that I could not observe any emotion, words, or metaphors in journalist discourse when it comes to this discourse strategy. Now, when it comes to topic inferiority, I coded some articles and news into this strategy due to the following criteria. So I argued that the topic of SSA was inferior to some other topic in a certain news if the topic of SSA was not in the headline, subtitle, or title of the news, if it wasn't in the lead of the news, if it didn't present the prevailing topic in the story, and if the topic of SSA was not initiated by the journalists. And I coded as inferior only those stories that satisfied all the 4 criteria, which is again very indicative of the media interest in this topic, given that we have 23% of stories that were almost unrelated to sex-selective abortion. You can see that out of these 23%, we have 63% of articles that were non-gender based. You can get a feeling of the topic of these articles through their headlines, and 36% of those articles that made SSA inferior to other topic were gender-based. Now, when it comes to discourse strategy of authority, this strategy overlaps with factual discourse strategy in several aspects. So both authority and factual discourse strategy dominantly use factual genres. They have passive approach, which means they argue that the sex selection exists in Montenegro, but they never ask why. And I argued at the very beginning of my presentation that it is important not to only establish the presence of sex-selective abortion and prenatal sex selection, but to investigate the context that fuels the demand for prenatal sex selection. Now, what is different between authority and factual discourse strategy is the existence of mental modes, actually emotion, words, and metaphors that definitely impute some kind of subjective attitude of the journalist. So you can see several examples where the journalist classifies Montenegro as one of the countries with the harshest treatment towards the gentle sex. So we can see one very prejudiced form here, since the research shows that every other woman was the victim of some form of violence, and that women in our country are unwanted. So we have in both of these examples very imprecise sources such as statistics, research, so it lacks precision and personalization, but we also have emotion, words, and metaphors which indicate some kind of subjective stance of the journalists. So harshest, such as harshest, gentle, then let it be healthy and male. This is a very clear metaphor, suspicion, etc. Now, when it comes to the discourse strategy of direct support, to clarify immediately the nature of this discourse strategy, I will say that the report by journalists, the investigative story by journalists, Svetlana Slavujevic falls into this discourse strategy. So 7% of the media stories was trying to unravel the context of sex-selective abortion. And they dominantly used women which underwent SSA anonymously, of course, as their own sources. You can also see that they aimed at investigating that gray zone where the practice of SSA is conducted, given that, as I said, this is prohibited in Montenegro. This is also a very small society, so it could be very easy to find out who among doctors is conducting this practice illegally. Therefore, most women go to Belgrade to do a sex-selective abortion. Now, when it comes to the analysis of the comments, you can see the dominant discourse strategies among the audience's discourse. So we can see condemnation, naturalization of the female identity, politicization, marginalization, and skepticism. I will go over each of these strategies with examples. What is also important to note here is that socio-cognitive discourse studies look for individual mental modes, emotion, words, and metaphors in the media discourse. But I also investigate how does the discourse the journalists use resonate with the discourse from the media audience, whether there is any influence or any observable connection between the two. So in the upper left corner, you can see the example of the discourse strategy of condemnation. And it is interesting that every fifth comment in this discourse strategy blamed women directly for the practice of SSA and for a distorted sex ratio. And in the lower right corner, you can see the discourse strategy of naturalization, which I defined as a discourse which actually reduces women to her predefined patriarchal roles, treats women only through the point of, through the vision of mother and wife, and also provides a very straightforward reference to her physical appearance. So you can see in the lower left corner that maybe that some columns written by women contained comments that were referencing to their physical appearance. This conclusion was completely absent from the male comments, actually comments written by male to be precise. So there were no comments that were referring to the appearance of male authors of the columns compared to female. Now, the discourse strategy of politicization interpreted the existence of sex-selective abortion as an outcome of the 3 decades long governance of the former incumbent party, Democratic Party of Socialists, of some EU attempt or NATO. So the domination of these political actors was present in these discourse strategies. Now, when it comes to the examples of marginalization and skepticism, those were the comments that dominantly treated the practice of sex-selective abortion as irrelevant or something that is not important. And they doubted the existence of this practice as well. I will leave this slide a bit more so that you can actually read the content of these comments. Finally, what I aimed in my research was to extract the emotion, words, and metaphors that belong to each discourse strategy. And this was particularly easy to do with discourse from the audiences, where you can see which words, which emotion words, and which metaphors were prevailing in each discourse strategy. So for an example, for condemnation, we have terms such as sad, discriminating, uncivilized, uneducated, shameful, abnormal, tribal, irreversible, rude. And for the strategy of naturalization, we have weaker, emotional, calming, desirable, childbirth, caregiving, marriage, motivating, beauty. So again, a reference to women's physical appearance and to their basic of mother and wife. With the politicization, it was again straightforward to and easy to extract the emotion words that were existing in this discourse strategy. So you can see various examples such as powerful, European, criminal, controlled, crisis, blackmailing, forcing, order, prohibit. And these were directed to those actors that I mentioned, which were blamed for the existence of prenatal sex selection in Montenegro, such as NATO, EU, Democratic Party of Socialists. Now, for marginalization and skepticism, these were the terms that dominated this discourse strategy: unimportant, untrue, unclear, wrong, disbelief, opposite, lie, defamation, coincidence. Metaphors were generally less present in audiences' discourse compared to emotion words. However, I could identify different metaphors in different discourse strategies. So you can see several examples, such as we need to escape from this jungle urgently, which was found in a condemnation strategy. They compared women with sexual slaves, those who are conducting the practice of SSA, they treated as beasts. They also said that we hit the rock bottom, while in the naturalization, as you can see, we have the career of the human species, so women as a career of the human species, women as someone who brings life into the world and gives birth to hogs. This is expression typical for Montenegro. Now, for Politicization, again, we have a very straightforward reference to different political actors. Thieves, monkeys on branches, they are lined their pockets. This was dominantly directed to non-governmental actors, which created the campaign Unwanted. So they interpreted the existence of this campaign as the attempt to spend the money that the EU fund gave to them. Then marginalization and skepticism. As I said, this is the discourse strategy, where the topic of sex-selective abortion was treated as irrelevant or non-existent. Now, when it comes to the general conclusions from this part of my research, first, what I noticed is that the media discourse is dominantly passive. And when I say the media discourse, I mean primarily on journalist discourse. So the media discourse is dominantly passive and with a very occasional usage of analytical approach, which means that factual genres were dominating this sample and the media initiative was very modest. Furthermore, in those articles that were SSA related, almost a fifth of them were almost unrelated to the practice of SSA, so where the topic of sex-selective abortion was inferior to other published information. Also, the journalists' usage of opinions, emotion, words, and metaphors was rarely proactive, except for direct discourse, direct support discourse strategy, where they actually argued for continuous scrutiny and investigation of the issue of sex-selective abortion. And finally, one very important finding from this research is that I established the social cognitions between those who produce the media content and those who consume it. For an example, comments that were written in direct support discourse strategy had condemnation as a major reaction from the audience. So I did not succeed to find comments that were doubting the existence of the practice of sex-selective abortion under those texts that contained, for an example, personal testimonial of women that underwent sex-selective abortion. On the other hand, those news that were published in statistical discourse strategy or authority discourse strategy, where journalists provide only statistical information and further projections of prenatal sex selection in Montenegro, comments were dominantly marginalizing the existence of this practice or interpreting the consequences of SSA through the lack of women that will give birth. So we can actually see how different media discourse provoked different audiences' response. Under those texts that were not unraveling the context of SSA and that did not provide in-depth information about prenatal sex selection, audience doubted the existence of this practice, and this conclusion was absent from those stories that contained very personalized testimonials or that investigated the context for sex-selective abortion. Now, equally important here is to identify various limitations that are present in this part of my research. So first, sociocognitive discourse studies are unable to identify the clear linkage between journalists and audiences' mental modes. This actually means that through the discourse analysis, I cannot identify whose personality structure or what kind of personality structure is behind the screen, and to which extent the values, beliefs, pre-existing values and beliefs of that person change when he or she reads text written in a certain discourse strategy. Also, it is very important to investigate different contextual factors, which was not the topic of this research, but could serve as a direction for further research. It is important to investigate the set of contextual factors that actually prevent the continuous and in-depth interest of the Montenegrin media in investigating the practice of sex-selective abortion. This can be indicative of the general media atmosphere in Montenegro and some substantive issues that the market has, or to a low level of gender-based awareness and the application of gender-sensitive language. These are some of the references that I used in this presentation and in my study. And I'm very grateful for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and